All right, yes, welcome to tonight's panel. We have a full set, and I was saying to someone that, just any one of the talks, I'm sure, can elicit a dozen questions each, but we will see, or at least hypothetically, but I haven't yet, except for maybe David kind of caught, I started to mention to him that if no one asks any questions, I have not only the C.S. Lewis Reader's Encyclopedia, but I also have the, at the time, it's fairly old now, I guess, the New Tolkien Companion. So if no one has any questions, I will flip through, find an obscure fact, and see if anyone knows the answer. Or I could go grab my book and say, okay, is this quote from Lewis or not, or is it the context? We could play that game too. So, but anyway, so I mean, it's about the some of the talks that were earlier today, and then I guess. Hal didn't get enough time on the mic. No, he's going to have some time tomorrow, so he's rejoining us. And then, David didn't actually speak today either, did he? So I'm not sure about that. But anyway, nevertheless, they are great gentlemen, as well as the other speakers as well. So go ahead and start standing up and lining up for questions, and because it's kind of wide open to the themes of their talk, essentially. And then we can go from there.
Question, but I want to precede it by, I'm not going to pose this as a question, but I assume everybody in the audience wants to hear Sarah talk about Narnia. So I'll just put that out. But then the question is, I mean, I've been learning a lot about the Inklings while I've been here. And the more I learn, the odder it seems that this bunch of people should ever have gotten together. Especially when we're thinking about the Bible and religion. I mean, we've got some Catholics, we've got an evangelical Protestant, we've got Charles Williams, whatever he is, we've got George MacDonald, who believes in fairies. I mean, how did these people, what do you think drew them together if in fact religion was something that they all had in common?
Okay, yes.
I can start with that. Part of it is the Wade Center's responsibility, because in the early 60s, a Wheaton College professor figured out that this guy named C.S. Lewis was going to be a real big bestseller someday. And he already, of course, had been on the cover of Time magazine. I hope all of you have seen that signed cover of Time magazine that's down in Stan Shelley's bookshop. I mean, it's very exciting. But
last time I looked, it wasn't there.
Did you buy it for me, David? Thank you.
So this professor named Clyde Kilby just started writing C.S. Lewis, telling him how he liked his books, and started saving those letters. And once C.S. Lewis died, he started writing Warnie Lewis, the brother that we heard about from Don King earlier today. And Clyde Kilby got this idea of starting a collection of C.S. Lewis. We just finished having Mark Noel, if some of you are familiar with that name. It's probably the most famous Christian historian in the English-speaking world. He's the one who wrote The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, if that rings a bell. He gave a series, he's on the Wade board now, and he gave a series of lectures on the reception of C.S. Lewis in America. And Protestants, especially evangelicals, had real reservations about C.S. Lewis. He was not immediately welcomed with open arms. And so Clyde Kilby was somewhat fighting against that current. And he got the collecting bug, and he thought, well, I shouldn't just be collecting first editions of Lewis and original manuscripts and correspondence. I should collect materials of everyone who influenced C.S. Lewis. So that explains these various authors. So George MacDonald was the person, C.S. Lewis was an avowed atheist, and he tells his story that at age 17, he was waiting for a train and needed something to read, and he just bought George MacDonald's Fantastes. And reports later that it baptized his imagination. And he reports that as his first stage to faith, but it was still over a decade, wasn't it, till he came to faith.
That was 17, then became Christian in his early 30s.
Yeah, right. So the next stage was Owen Barfield, and they were college friends. And Owen Barfield, who was the anthroposophist, he nevertheless convinced C.S. Lewis at university in Oxford that a person could be intelligent and still believe there is a God. So that was the important second step for Lewis. And then the third step, and I'm sure you've all heard about this, was when he was a professor at Oxford, when Tolkien was a professor. And Lewis gave the argument that how can you believe in Christianity? It's just one dying God myth among many. And we heard Sørina talk a little bit about the dying God myths. So Tolkien said, well, that myth became fact in Christianity, and that was the turning point in Lewis's life. So that explains those people, and then the others were either Inklings or people he identified as strong influences. So Inklings is just a little part of the many people you hear being talked about.
How?
Yes, let's distinguish between the 7 that the Wade Center focuses on, 7 English writers, and the Inklings. And there's some overlap, but they're not the same groups. Chesterton and MacDonald were dead. Dorothy L. Sayers was
Not that that would have stopped William.
Well, Williams, whom Tolkien referred to as the witch doctor, Dorothy L. Sayers was not one of the Inklings. Lewis, in an article, once said that he wasn't sure that Sayers was even aware that there was an Inklings, but I think she was aware of it. And Owen Barfield, who was an anthroposophist, he was not one of the Inklings. I know, and I'm the only person who will take that position, but I'll take it to the death. He was not one of the Inklings.
The boxing match will be later.
But the Inklings themselves, in Oxford, they have all sorts of clubs, but a club needs a faculty sponsor. And so there was a student who wanted to start a writing club, and he called his writing club the Inklings. And he asked Lewis and Tolkien to be the faculty sponsors. And they met a couple of times, and then the students stopped showing up, and it was just Lewis and Tolkien. And they said, well, let's keep it going, the Inklings. In a letter to Charles Williams, a fan letter, letters that crossed in the mail, because Williams just discovered Lewis when Lewis discovered Williams. Lewis said he wanted Williams to come up to Oxford and visit their writing club. They all lived in Oxford. They were all Christians, and they all were interested in writing. And at one point he said there were 5 of them early on, but besides him, so that was probably Tolkien, Dyson, Neville Coghill, Warney, yeah, and Adam Fox joined early on, and then it grew. Their doctor joined, Dr. Havard, and so they were, what they had in common was their interest in writing. The initial interest that brought Tolkien and Lewis together was the interest in Norse mythology. And then it just sort of grew. Probably the reason they fell apart in the late 1940s was because they became so diverse, not over religion, but over different interests. And they essentially stopped being a writing club by 1949 and only met in the mornings to be a talking club.
And I'll just add that the one thing they had in common
is that they loved to hear written compositions read out loud.
Okay, and Sørina has 10 questions for Hal. No.
But another way to get at the heart of the question maybe is how could such a diverse group of Christians come together? And I think that's just really a testament to what they were, which was they were interested in the mere Christianity. Basically, if you can affirm the Apostles' Creed, the basic doctrines, then they were able to debate everything else, even if it was as extreme as reincarnation, which is part of anthroposophy, or some of Williams's beliefs. So I think that's another interesting way to look at it.
All right, anyone else?
My question, in the 19th century, social scientists discovered something they call culture that floats in the air and is extremely powerful. Now, as I understand it, C.S. Lewis and the Inklings were very interested in power and spiritual power too. Did they, and by the way, that found, the rest of the church, some of it has worked with, particularly missionaries, have found that very relevant to their work. But my question is, did C.S. Lewis or any of the Inklings make the specific connection with culture? What the social scientists discovered, it happened to be in the Bible, in the New Testament 2,000 years earlier. You're familiar with the powers, particularly I like the King James, principalities and powers. Did they make that particular connection?
Yes, they didn't use that word. The word cultures, as you say, is a fairly recent addition to the vocabulary. In fact, Lewis did not like that word. But they talked about the world. And as Lewis, in his book, The Discarded Image, he describes the medieval world. And he didn't mean the real estate, but he meant the belief system, the customs, the way of thinking, the outlook. So what anthropologists would call culture, they referred to as the world, as did the Apostle Paul.
They recognized as power?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I believe they did. Lewis wrote an essay called Christianity and Culture. And as you mentioned, in the 19th century, there was increasing loss of credibility for traditional religion. And this religion of art came up, or this religion of culture. You think of Matthew Arnold and Ruskin and others, that somehow the best of humanity, the best that has been thought and said, was going to be a replacement for revealed religion. When you're talking about culture in this sense, you usually pronounce it culture. You kind of say, you've got to have culture. Lewis wrote an essay called Christianity and Culture, in which he really took on that idea that culture could ever replace revealed religion. In fact, he actually thought it was a dangerous movement. It was a competitor to traditional faith.
I think it would be interesting, because I know it's a really difficult question for anyone to say, what's your favorite book in general, or even within the Inklings, but I think it would be interesting to hear from each of you, like, what is one of your favorite works, either by an Inkling or someone who's Inkling adjacent, and why would you consider that your favorite?
Okay, all right. Should we go down the line? All right, Don, we'll start on this end.
Well, I think my favorite book by Warney would be his first book. And all of his books, in one way or another, are related to his interest, not just in 17th century French history, but in particular in Louis XIV. So he expends a lot of time really looking at Louis XIV's biography from about 3 or 4 different angles. And that's the book that set him off in terms of being respected not only by popular readers, but also by the historians who reviewed his book. For me, my own personal, I guess, favorite book of the Inklings would probably be Screwtape Letters and Perelandra. You can't just do one. Screwtape Letters, because when I read that book, I read it as an anti-devotional. And I'm always pained when I read it because of the way in which Lewis reveals the kind of spiritual attack that I don't always realize I'm under. And then I love Perelandra because of the beauty of the, I would call it the poetry. It's a work of prose poetry. And I think Lewis's imagination is just, it just soars in that book.
Woo. The problem of reductionism is one that Lewis would have disapproved. So I'll cheat the way Don did. And whereas I consider The Lord of the Rings to be the greatest prose narrative of the 20th century, probably my favorite of the Inklings books would be Mere Christianity. But they were all doing such different things. I mean, you've got Lord David Cecil, whom I love, and his. If any of y'all have watched Victoria on the, okay, he wrote a 2-volume biography of Lord Melbourne, that was John Kennedy's favorite book, and he kept it on his bedside table. But anyway, let me leave it at that, or because I'll drone on and on. Oh, you've got one. Got your own.
Well, this is a question that if you ask me again tomorrow, I'll probably give you a different answer. So I'm really bad at picking favorites of anything, but favorite books is particularly difficult. And I'm going to be deliberately limiting to Lewis, and I'll limit it to Narnia because it makes it easier. So I'm going to go with Silver Chair because I like Puddlegarm's kind of final defiance. I think it's great.
Mm-hmm. Till We Have Faces. That's the best novel ever written. Here we go.
I would choose the same book that if C.S. Lewis were sitting here among us, he might choose, and that is Dorothy Sayers' The Man Born to be King, the book I told you about when it was finally, the 12 radio plays were published together in 1943, and Sayers sent a copy of the first edition to C.S. Lewis, along with a note where she was imitating the screw tape letters and pretending to be a senior devil talking to a junior devil and telling him about all these people who are reacting to her radio plays. But poor Sayers, she got the Christians protesting because it wasn't King James English, but then once the people, agnostics, listened to it, she got hate mail from them because she still believed in miracles. And she still believed that Jesus rose from the dead and was proclaiming it in these plays. And she has this funny line in her letter to C.S. Lewis. She says, and I have this agnostic on my hand. He will go on and write me letters and wear me out. I should just hand him off to you. You like souls. I don't. So, C.S. Lewis read this collection of 12 radio plays and was so moved by it, he read it every single year from 1943 on for his Easter devotions until he died.
I think my favorite book of all these authors is The Dark Tower by C.S. Lewis. No, I want to, no. That's actually
inside joke.
One of the worst things. Actually, I would say the collected letters of Lewis. All through the 90s, Crystal and I came to the Wade Center. I have 120 pages of handwritten notes on his letters. They're so meaty. People would send him genuine questions of a spiritual nature. Often they were really in pain and they wanted counseling. And he considered that to be part of his ministry to answer them. He said in one letter he'd been writing letters for 9 hours. In another one he said that was his 35th handwritten letter he'd written that day. But they're very meaty letters, and many of the ideas that we love in his published books he would take the same time and the same great analogies just writing to one person. So I go back and back again to the collected letters. Was that applause?
Applause, yes. I just want to go on record. I don't think in my lifetime I've written 35 letters, but, you know. Now, emails, it's a different story. Okay. All right.
Thank
all
you.
right, thanks. For the record, also, the screw tape letters for me. But, you know, I did a study guide, so.
Thank you, and thank you all for your presentations. It strikes me that all of these, this is a very Anglo-centric, not to mention Oxbridge circle of people. And there were some interesting things going on, particularly in theology on the continent during the 20s and 30s. And I wonder to what extent, if any, these folks were aware of that and whether they had conversations or thoughts about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll start by jumping in with Charles Williams, who had at least two strong influences I can mention. The first is that he was apparently the first person in England to lecture on Søren Kierkegaard, and then he saw the English translations of Kierkegaard through the Oxford University Press and wrote some introductions, lectured about him at essentially an adult continuing ed, like a community college kind of setting in London. So he helped to introduce that continental philosopher theologian. And then the other non-European influence that we can see coming through Williams is the Eastern influence on the occult. The orders that I spoke about today were keen on bringing over Indian yogis and so forth, and there were a couple of notable ones who traveled around England lecturing. So he was promulgating some of that Eastern influence as well. That's all I got.
Both Sayers and Lewis became involved with clubs that would bring atheists and agnostics into conversations with Christians. And so for Lewis, it was the Socratic Club in Oxford, and Sayers helped start something called St. Anne's House in London. And they would have these very respectful conversations about the disappearance of certitude in Christianity. Both Sayers and Lewis were writing at the height of modernism, where people were just assuming that Christianity was a thing of the past, it was a superstition that we are progressing beyond. And so they were very brave souls in terms of being somewhat countercultural at the time. Some of you may have noticed one of my books down there is called How Postmodernism Serves My Faith, and I give examples from both Sayers and Lewis showing how they would have welcomed postmodernism, because postmodernism was calling into question modernist progressivism, this idea that humans are evolving, they don't have this need to believe in superstitious religious realities anymore.
Hal?
We know that different of the Inklings were fairly well read in what was going on in theological circles at the time. What we don't have is a set of minutes of what they talked about at their meetings. We have letters from Jack to Warney at the beginning of World War II. We have letters from Charles Williams to his wife. We have letters from Tolkien to his son Michael. Most valuable, we have Warney's diaries, and sometimes those will mention what is being discussed, but it's really hard to put together exactly what kind of discussions of theologians were taking place. So you pretty much have to just suppose they brought what they knew to the table when they were discussing theological issues, and usually every week they would get eventually around to a theological discussion, regardless of how they started out.
Lewis kept up on some of the French theologians, but he didn't like them very much. He read Desjardins and he read Bergson, and he satirizes the life force philosophy in Perelandra. He wrote to a Catholic about Desjardins, the idea of the evolving God. And he says, I'm all for your order, trying to shut this fellow up. So he did read them, but he wasn't very sympathetic to them.
All right, next question.
A question for the moderator, I guess. Hypothetical, Lewis comes back, comes to you at wherever your office, if you have an office, might be. It says, I understand you're doing some podcasts. I'm not quite sure I understand what these are, but I think I ought to speak in some way using this medium. So anybody got any ideas what these topics might be in these podcasts?
Okay, so I guess the question is, if Lewis was alive today and doing a podcast, which in some regards, what led to Mere Christianity was sort of like that, what would he be addressing today? I'll let anyone here. Yep.
It sounds almost like a plug. We have a podcast at the Wade Center. Does everybody at the table
You
have a
do.
podcast?
Almost, yeah.
But recently we found some tapes where Bill Gresham went over after Joy's death and took a tape recorder and asked C.S. Lewis if he would read some passages from his books. So we have some actual excerpts of Lewis reading from Perelandra and That Hideous Strength. The passage from That Hideous Strength is the one where Merlin asked those questions. And our podcast, the number of listeners tripled for those episodes where we gave excerpts. So all I know is that would do really well for our podcast numbers. Instead of All About Jack, it would be Here's Jack, right?
Here's Jack.
I'll prepare the ritual for you.
What's interesting for us, we started this podcast maybe 3.5 years ago, and I have some flyers here if you're interested. It also explains how to access the podcast, but it is now being listened to in 104 different countries. The third largest population that's listening to it is India, and after America and Canada, and it's being downloaded as well as in several primarily Muslim countries. And it shows that there is this real hunger for intellectual engagement with people who are imaginative. In other words, people are thirsting for the baptismal waters to baptize their imaginations. And we have a lot of fun with it. It's primarily David and I having conversations about C.S. Lewis, Sayers, Tolkien texts, along with a master's in theology who happens to be our producer. So I encourage you to tune in if you can stand listening to us anymore.
I invited someone to listen to our podcast, and they said, oh, I wish I could, but it's just not a good time for me. They haven't got the concept yet.
Okay. I was talking with someone earlier today about how C.S. Lewis learned over his career how to speak to the everyday person and not just to an elite Oxbridge audience. And so he thought that you didn't really understand any concept unless you could explain it in plain language. So I imagine that if he came back today and did a podcast, it would basically be Mere Christianity for our times, right? That he would try to find, how can I explain the basic fundamental concepts of the Christian faith to these 21st century people? I think it would be a really big challenge, but I wish he would. So you should all try it and see who succeeds.
He might do it as a rapper, I think, now. Do you think? Lewis? No.
I really hope not. That would be terrible. I think I agree. If you look at the kind of issues that he was exploring in his writing, he was thinking about, okay, so what does it mean to live as a Christian in my contemporary experience? And how do I communicate what that is in real life terms, rather than these deep theological concepts, which I'll get to through this kind of approach. And I think that's the kind of accessibility you need in a podcast. What doesn't work is trying to do all the heavy-handed stuff. There are podcasts that do that, and they really just don't have the traction. And I don't think Lewis would be would be capable or would want to do it that way anyway. But I agree. I think he'd be thinking about, okay, so what are the contemporary issues facing people here today? Okay, and what contemporary issues are Christians facing? And where's the intersection there? And what do we do with that? And so I think it's going to change pretty much on a daily basis. But certainly thinking about, like, what does it mean to live out in the world with faith, I think.
Anyone else? On the end? David, again?
I'm going to circle back. When you read Lewis's essays, one of the things that's amazing is how few of them are out of date. I love Chesterton, but he was very engaged in his generation. And so a lot of the essays are about distributivism or the Dreyfus Affair, things that were going on, the Marconi scandal. Lewis, he'll often start with a contemporary reference, such as the Russian cosmonaut saying, I went to space and didn't see God. But then he will build out to much more universal issues. He said in one of his essays that our Christian speech should be contemporary in dress, but timeless at heart. And I think he would apply that same formula if he were able to speak today.
Over here.
This question is for Dr. Waters, anybody that wants to answer it. This is kind of a grandmother question. Most kids are reading the Narnia series pretty early, like early grade school. When do you think is a good time to maybe talk to them about the more moralistic Christian principles that are in those books? And also, do you have any ideas or ways that we might be able to counter? I know this is happening in our local school system where we have some parents trying to ban that book, those books, trying to get these books out of the library.
Okay, great. So I think, I guess I'll speak from personal experience. So I, like lots of people, I suppose, when I first read Narnia, or rather had it read to me, I had no idea of the moral underpinning. Well, I knew the moral underpinning. I had no idea of the kind of potential Christian links in it. I was too young to really get it. And I appreciated them as a story. And I'm really glad, actually, that I had that experience, because I distinctly remember when someone told me otherwise, and I was gutted, absolutely gutted at the time. I've come to terms with it. But I had a friend who was brought up in a very atheistic background, and we were friends at primary school, so we would have been about, I don't know, I suppose we would have been about 10 years old or something, and I'd already heard some of Narnia. We didn't actually have all the books. I didn't read all of Narnia until I was in my 20s. We couldn't afford all the books, so we only had some of them. So I read it in a kind of weird order as well. But anyway, but I remember her saying, well, how can you read that? I mean, Aslan is just God. Why would you read that? And it's just this moment of absolute realization. Oh. And I think that what is great about the stories is that they work really well as stories. And so I think any kind of explaining should be a kind of realization process, rather than, well, this is what it's about. Partly because I think that's generally true with fiction. That's how I would approach fiction. And I don't know how it is in the States, because I guess it's a little bit different, but one of the reasons that a lot of children are switching off from Narnia or not being read Narnia in the UK is partly we're a much more secular nation. And it's partly, I think, the effect of outspoken critics who have basically lumped Lewis in this kind of pot of, well, he's anti this, he's anti that, he's anti the other thing. And when you actually break down those arguments, they don't often hold water. Some of them do. And I think there are times to have a more nuanced conversation with children, but I think it's helpful for the child to be leading that quite often, that process. So there was another part of the question which I feel like I've forgotten. Was that?
The books being banned.
Books being banned, thank you. So I think that no book should be banned, which is maybe controversial. But I think I teach a text to my students, and they always hate it, and it's Milton's Areopagitica, which is a very, very long text in which he talks about why books shouldn't be banned. Now, he has a particular agenda here. His book has been banned. Well, he's written a tract on divorce, and he gets into some hot water about it. But in this text, he talks about how books have living and breathing souls, and they have the ability to enliven us and to wake up our conscience. And so he argues in that piece, among other things, that actually the duty should rest with the individual. That's actually slightly more complicated what he says, but I think that's a helpful kind of benchmark. And so I'm always very skeptical about why people want to ban books and what they think they're going to achieve by that banning, because usually it makes people read them more.
Yeah.
So.
I'm curious, maybe since it was about Narnia and reading, David, if you had some thoughts.
Which the one about being Christian? Well, this is a little different story, but I was teaching at Elizabethtown, which is a non-Christian college in Pennsylvania before we came to the Waite Center. And a student said, you know, I read The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, but I really enjoyed the story, but I don't understand why people say it's Christian. And I said, well, Aslan died for someone else's fault, and then he's gone and they're heartbroken, but then he comes back again and they're jubilant. Does that remind you of anything? And my student said, oh, do you mean like Gandalf? Yeah. They're both dying gods. But for people who think it's too didactic as Christianity, believe me, it's in some cases it's not didactic enough.
All right. Any other thoughts, even though it was directed? Okay. All right.
I would like to ask the question. So much of the history that we have, that you all have talked about and read about and written about, the information largely has come from letters. And now that letters are no longer being written, what do you think is going to be a way of communicating with where texts are taking the place of letters, communication among families is taking the place with an email that says, hi, how are you doing today, and whatever the chatter. The other thing that goes along with that is I'd like to know if you think the writing that is going on, how do you get children to read more rather than just click on their fingers? And in the process of the time that they spend with games, what about Christianity being in the games that they do? That probably doesn't make any sense, but
No, it does.
since you all are thinking of, I graduated from college 71 years ago, so I'm old, but I see this as such a change in what young people do, and I just wonder how do you take the place of those magnificent letters that have been read? Written.
When I was vice president of our university, I had responsibility for the library, among other things, and I discovered that it's now common practice among librarians to call the stacks of every book that's 3 years old. And a library is no longer seen as a repository of the accumulation of human knowledge, but just sort of a passing snapshot. I also had responsibility for technology. And one of the problems you've probably noticed is that your floppy disk doesn't work in your computer anymore, nor your hard disk. And for most of you, not your CD or DVD. And soon thumb drives will be obsolete. You've also noticed that the software changes over and over and over again. And I have a vision of 100 years from now, us having lost the 20th century. That in most libraries, they throw away the 16mm projectors and the tape recorders and all of the hardware necessary to read the software, whatever it might be. And I think we're going to have a real crisis in the future. We're relying on technology because it's so much better and faster than paper, only it's like shifting sand. We also heard about archives that have been disposed of because they just weren't seen as necessary anymore. So I think we have a general crisis facing us like the 6th century. So that's one piece of it. And add to that, will there be a record of what people think and how they communicate and what their ideas are that we have with these massive volumes of Lewis's letters. If everybody prints out their emails, like I do,
so they'll have books, but they won't have trees.
Because the email system we have now at my university only goes back a few years, and there's no way to access emails 10 years ago. And so the record is just gone. It's absolutely gone. I'll do that part of it and let somebody else do another part of Sørina.
I'm going to respectfully give the exact opposite answer. I think it'll be much easier for historians and biographers of the future because all the communications will be very easy to access because they'll be digitized and searchable. And I think that the amazing, amazing work of people like we heard last night of digitizing huge quantities of text is going to go on and on and on, and we'll continue upgrading it so that it can be accessible. So I have the opposite. I'm really optimistic about young people's reading. I mean, the fact that they're on a phone doesn't necessarily mean they're not reading. I was reading the Epic of Gilgamesh on here the other day, public domain texts and Internet Archive and Gutenberg.org. It's awesome. I mean, there's only a small percentage of kids who read great literature, but that's always been the case in the entire history of the world. And it's questions of education and access and privilege. But I'm really optimistic about the preservation of texts and culture and civilization and the reading of the future.
Thank you. People still write letters as well, or at least I still write letters. I don't think that the two are necessarily mutually exclusive. You can write emails and you can write letters. What we do with that is a different question.
Any other thoughts?
I'm putting my most important thoughts on TikTok now.
Well, that reminds me, the other day, there was a conversation where TikTok came up about someone using it, and I said, well, do they dance in these videos? Because that's what most of them are. So I've been told. Yes, Kristen.
Good evening. Thank you all for your talks today and yesterday. I actually have a question that's going to be for Sørina and David and then sort of expand. So I guess everyone knows about the conversation that the Inklings had about, well, if those books don't exist, we need to write them, right, and sort of appropriate these things to our generation. So on that, Sørina, you mentioned earlier today, I know you kind of got abbreviated in the talk, but you mentioned that in the last 15 years there have been Holy Grail type stories. I'm really interested to see how this generation, and we had a discussion last night about sort of how is this generation sort of handling, what's it like for a new generation to appropriate these stories. And so David, I didn't know if you had any sort of Pilgrim's Progress, stories that have came out that you can share. And then for the whole panel, do you have any contemporary writers, authors, poets that you read or that are spiritually satisfying that you'd like to share with us?
There's a lot of interesting work coming out of the Rabbit Room, which is this group of artists and writers and musicians around Franklin, Tennessee. And the Wing Feathers saga is really charming for children. That's going to be turned into a movie. I really like Lee Finger's Peace Like a River. I thought that was a great piece of, I call it spiritual realism. It's not magical realism. And I have a novel called Looking for the King, which I believe is...
Available at your local bookstore or on Amazon?
Yeah, it's taken 10 years, but I think it's just about to become a bestseller. So we're... What was the one you mentioned to me on the Holy Grail? Somebody mentioned Glastonbury, a modern series by a Christian author.
Oh, yeah.
The Glastonbury Stories or the Glastonbury... I just had that recommended to me today.
Anybody?
Blank. The Arthurian adaptations that are being made in the last decade or so are wildly varied, and they're pretty exciting as far as letting a lot of new voices and perspectives come in. really exploding open the canon and so forth. Now, a lot of them are bringing in characters from alternative viewpoints, so they're queering the canon, as it were, right? So there's a lot of Arthuriana with gender bending and trans characters and so forth. And then there are ones that are setting it in other geographical locations, other time periods. There's a really interesting one where a Muslim jurist is called in to rule on Queen Guinevere. So just an enormous diversity of Arthurian texts. One that I would recommend is Pendragon's Heir by Susanna Rowntree. And I think she got the essence of what does it mean to achieve the Holy Grail more beautifully than maybe any other author. So I recommend that one. Pendragon's Heir by Susanna Rowntree.
All right, Don.
My contribution is really just sort of a speculative one, and that is you ask about all these video games, and it seems to me that what would be wonderful if we had more committed Christians who were designing and developing these games that are so incredibly popular. And maybe you know some people that are doing that. My daughter works for Bungie, which is a huge gaming company in Seattle. And I know that one of her concerns is not necessarily to bring Christian stories necessarily to the potential audience there, but she has an understanding of the Christian faith. She was raised as a Christian, and she understands the power of those kinds of stories. So I'm hopeful that in the future we'll see that happening.
I know that the Exploring the Lord of the Rings online is really popular. It's huge. And apparently, I don't play it, but apparently it's like the most faithful adaptation of Tolkien's world in any genre, and really beautiful. So that might appeal to young people. And then the other cultural aspect right now that I think is sort of the heir to these stories is the whole superhero genre. I mean, what is the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the DC Comics world but these same ancient legends come to life for younger people today?
Anyone else? Okay.
I know the conference is primarily about literary things, but in their time, well, in our time, certainly since the time of the Inklings to now, sacred music has changed a great deal. I think that's fair to say. But in their time also, sacred music changed a great deal. So what I wonder is, what do we know about what those folks felt about the sacred music that they experienced if they went to church, or if it was headed in the wrong direction, did they think, or in the right direction? Were things being fixed? Was it better? Was it worse? What did they like about it from a Christian ministry perspective, let's say especially? So that's what I'm wondering about.
C.S. Lewis hated hymns. He said they were sixth-rate music and seventh-rate poetry. Isn't that it? That's right. Yeah.
Although he did like Ralph Vaughan Williams, who was the outstanding Anglican hymn writer. He met him once and was surprised at his humility. So that would be one exception. I think he said the hymns were the dead wood of the Anglican services. Who could say such a thing?
Other things about hymns, sayers?
Music provides a good analogy for what I was talking about in terms of the idolizing of signs, insofar as many of us probably remember when drums and electric guitars came into church and the controversy that generated, much like the controversy that was generated when Sayers wrote plays about Jesus and didn't use King James English. In my book down there called Changing Signs of Truth, I give the example of a woman who wrote a letter of protest to her church rector, saying how this new music that was coming out the lyrics were banal, and the music was just not mellifluous the way regular hymns are. And it turns out this letter was written in 1873 about what a friend we have in Jesus.
Just to add one piece to it, Lewis loved music. It was one of his great loves from his teenage years. And remember that the hymns that he was talking about were the hymns in the Church of England hymn book that often violated any sense of meter and rhythm and were just very difficult to sing, just unsingable. And so his problem wasn't with music. He wouldn't have encountered any new hymns because the new hymns weren't in the hymn book, and it isn't like today where we're going to try out a new hymn this morning. Just repeat after me. And so, that was his problem. He loved music, and this just wasn't music for him.
All right. Yes, sir.
I'm back for Sarah and Shakespeare and Narnia.
Okay. I'll give just a brief kind of outline. So there are a few ways you can approach thinking about Shakespeare and Narnia. One is thematic. So sometimes Lewis is drawing on a whole play and really steeping a text within that. So thinking about an easy example of this, I suppose, would be The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which, among many, many other things, is also influenced by his readings of The Tempest, which you can track through when you see how he engages with it as a reader, and then how he writes about it, particularly when he's thinking about magic, which he spends just a couple of pages doing in the opening of his big volume on English literature in the 16th century. Despite the fact it's excluding drama, he does allow The Tempest in alongside Dr. Faustus and a couple other plays as well. So that's an example of a text where it's kind of steeped in some of the imagery. So an obvious example would be the kind of Prospero type figure that you get. It's the magician on the island with the duffel pods or monopods, whatever you want to call them. They're great. And then sometimes he uses direct Shakespearean references. That might be to a character, or it might be to a quotation from a Shakespeare play, a little bit like I was talking about earlier with his apologetics. So when he's referencing a character, he's usually referencing much more than just the moment in the text where he's referencing that particular character. So he references Bottom and Hamlet in Narnia. Bottom gets referenced twice, Hamlet only once. And so there's that kind of referencing going on as well. And it seems to me that he's doing different things when he's using these quotations, kind of depending on the context. And one really interesting example of how this might work is in The Silver Chair. He references Hamlet, and he's talking about Prince Rilian, who is, I don't want to ruin the story. I hope everyone here has read The Silver Chair. Anyway, Prince Rilian is not quite sure what's going on. He's being drugged, basically, and he is living in the underworld. But there's a great mission to try and find Prince Rilian, and he is described as looking altogether a little bit like Hamlet in the text. And this is mostly because he's dressed in black, right? There's the opening scene of famously Hamlet is dressed in mourning, and there's a wedding going on. Well, not in the opening scene, but early on in Hamlet. But what's interesting there is that Lewis is drawing much more on that. Hamlet is feigning, right? He's pretending to be mad, or maybe he is mad, and there's this kind of shift between the two. Prince Rilian is trapped in this state in between the two things. So yeah.
Can you get closer to the mic?
Oh, yeah, sorry. And he also is riffing on the fact that Puddleglum is deeply engaged with a kind of melancholy and sadness. So we expect that he is the one who's going to look altogether a little bit like Hamlet, and he doesn't. So that's kind of interesting too. So that's the flavor of how you can do Shakespeare and Narnia.
I read The Nine Tailors 4 times, and then I learned that Dorothy Sayers wrote theology. And I read Narnia, and then, wow, that same guy wrote Mere Christianity. So, I'll try that. And I read Tolkien probably 25 or 30 times, The Lord of the Rings, and even made my way through the Silmarillion and the Akallabeth before I realized that there was even something like Leaf by Nigel that would be more theological in its nature. What do you think? We're all people that are interested in the nuts and bolts of the philosophy, but it seems to me like there's a world out there that would rather read the Nine Tailors. And I wonder if you would comment on that and how we might work that, how that might be used, how that might be a path to where people might want to go.
First thing I would say is that in the modern world, 3 new kinds of stories emerged in pretty quick succession. Science fiction, 1817, the mystery story, 1841, and then fantasy. When Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, the libraries and the bookstores didn't know where to put it. It usually wound up in the science fiction section, which is just bizarre, but they didn't know what to do with it. So these are recent kind of stories that I think are peculiar to the modern world, that they deal with the kinds of issues that the modern world is trying to deal with. And if you like one kind, you don't necessarily like the other. Lewis loved science fiction, he loved fantasy, he didn't care for mystery. Dorothy L. Sayers loved mystery, she loved science fiction. I don't know that she cared much for fantasy. And so different kinds of stories appeal to different people in different ways. The science fiction story lends itself to dealing with major ethical, moral, spiritual questions. And those just keep popping up in all these scenarios of science fiction. The mystery story, it's a tricky thing. The mystery story only works if the audience brings to the story the concept of justice or right and wrong. The audience has to care who done it. They want the innocent person set free. They want the guilty person punished. They want the truth revealed. And all of a sudden, you're dealing with absolute values. And it's not as though there's someone in the story that you are personally invested in. It's imaginary. And so you are concerned with these absolute values and where do they come from. So right and wrong is a clue to the meaning of the universe is what the mystery story does. It reinforces that idea. So this idea of justice has to come from some place outside the author and outside the writer. Then there's fantasy. And Lord of the Rings, the way you can tell the Lord of the Rings is a Christian story, even though it doesn't mention God, they don't go to church, they don't pray, but it's a story that's been retold. And Wagner retold the story in the 19th century. It's one of the most popular opera series that's ever been written, and it is really the pinnacle of grand opera. Wagner's Ring, a 4-part opera series that takes about 16 or 17 hours to see. Why, it's like watching The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. But with Wagner, Wagner's a nihilist. And the motives are narcissistic, and everything ends in doom and futility. But the same basic story told by Tolkien, there's a motive of sacrificial love that's running through the actions of Frodo, the actions of Gandalf, and you can compare the heroes, Siegfried, the great warrior who is completely selfish, self-interested, and you compare him with Frodo or with
Aragorn.
Yeah, that's the one. The king who returned. And so the contrast, it's obvious this is what makes a story Christian. What kind of values and underlying beliefs. It's what Lewis called, well, he said the best apologetics is not more little Christian books, but more little books by Christians on every subject with the Christianity latent. And that's what you get with The Lord of the Rings and with fantasy. Well done. So fantasy can either be, it isn't necessarily Christian, but it lends itself to Christian values. That's a long answer.
That was good.
Anybody else want to address that?
Pretty good.
I'm dealing with the same issue right now in film. I have a book on film that was written, I meant it to be for Christians, but then a publisher, a secular publisher called Rutledge, wanted to produce it to market to secular universities on that teach courses in religion and film. And they said, we want you to tone down the Christianity, we want you to talk about other religions. And so at first I was discouraged, and then I thought, oh, this is a great opportunity. How can I channel Dorothy Sayers and preach the truth in new language? And so I was able to use philosophers and ultimately make the point that Christianity is different than all other religions because most religions operate by what the great philosopher Jacques Derrida called an economy of exchange, insofar as you go through this ritual, you get heaven in exchange. You say these words, you don't go to hell. You go through this rite, you touch this relic, you do jihad, and you get blessings in exchange. And this atheist philosopher said, for a religion to be authentic, salvation needs to be a gift. And he started quoting Jesus. So I could use this atheist philosopher and say, well, of all these religions, here's what distinguishes Christianity. And I'm basically preaching the gospel message, but in an underhanded way. So that was called salvation, Salvation from Cinema. Now, I'm writing a book on Dorothy Sayers' view of film. She loved film. And I'm calling it The Wages of Cinema. But I'm trying to address this very question. How can films that have been made by secular, agnostics, even atheists, how can the imago Dei be manifest in the creativity of the film? And one of the things that Sayers would say is something that is done purely for reputation, for status, or money, that's not true, that's not the imago Dei. There's other motivations going on. So, and the trouble with so many films and even stories now, and interestingly, Dorothy Sayers somewhat repudiated detective fiction because she says that's not like real life. Detective fiction, the murderer is always caught. Justice always reigns at the end. That's not the way life works. So, unfortunately, too many stories, too many films, they give you generic happy endings because those make more money.
I wanted to add one more title to the earlier question about more recent fiction. P.D. James was a great admirer of Dorothy Sayers and continued her tradition in some ways. She has a novel called Children of Men, which is, even though it's science fiction or futuristic, it's just loaded with Christian motifs and even biblical allusions. So I would recommend that for someone who's looking for more recent fiction.
Sørina.
One of the reasons that I think a lot of people turn to novels or films instead of to straight up theology books is because they're easier to read in several ways, but in one particular way, which is there's a perspective character to take us through the story, right? There's a Frodo who steps out of his door and goes on the journey, or there's a Lucy who opens a wardrobe and goes into the world. And so the pace of the story is set for you, and you go along on the journey. Whereas if you're working your way through a nonfiction piece of theology, you have to kind of set the pace for working through it, and there's not an obvious character-driven narrative thread.
Thank you, everyone, for coming here. Ron's going to close us out.
We close tonight. We'll see you tomorrow at 9. And please give one more round and thank these people for all they've done.